Hello and welcome to the summer edition of Words, London's Literary and Creative Arts Festival. I'm Joshua Lambier, the Artistic Director of the festival, and I'm coming to you live from Western University. As we all gather tonight, virtually, near and far, across Canada and beyond, I want to situate us in the territory on which this event is zooming to you. I'm currently in University College at Western, just up the hill from the banks of Deshkanzibi, or Antler River, also known as the Thames River, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinoochton peoples. In the London area, there were Treaty 6 London Township, Treaty 7 Sombre Township, and Treaty 21 Longwoods, as well as the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and water and as vital contributors to the Words Festival. The river that flows nearby, Deshkanzibi, also connects us to local Indigenous communities, including the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. It's my privilege to have the opportunity to visit with three authors this evening: writer and critic André Forget, writer and nehiyaw aunty Jessica Johns, as well as author and creative writing professor Aaron Schneider, to explore new horizons for literary experimentation, as well as their own experiments of literature. Our event tonight was sparked, at least in part, in response to André's persuasive and provocative call in his new anthology, After Realism, to turn our collective attention towards a new generation of writers in Canada who are, as he says, grappling with a tradition dominated by the realist short story, a tradition that emerges from a larger commitment to realism as a perennial motive in literature and other artistic forms. Realism claims to represent things as they are or were, and yet it does so through the conventions that tell us in a given place and time what is to be taken as real in literature and the work of art. We can think, for example, of the realist style's hallmarks: the linear narrative, the omniscient narrator, transparency of language, all of which testify to what André diagnoses as a certain kind of exhaustion with realism. In Canadian literature, the realist tradition is also dominated by what the critic Alex Good has called the monsters of Can Lit, to use his phrase, or the post-World War II generation of writers who have become establishment figures of, and to put this in quotation marks, Can Lit. How then is a new generation of writers challenging the orthodoxies and conventions of this tradition to reimagine literary expression and experiment with new forms? Over the next hour or so, we are going to engage with new works by André, Jessica, and Aaron. We're going to hear them read from their work, and we're going to take your questions in chat and on the webinar's Q&A function. So please do send along your thoughts and questions and cogitations anytime during tonight's event to join the discussion as we go along. I will be here to take the questions out of the chat and the Q&A and serve them up over to our authors. I would also like to recognize the generous support of the Ontario Arts Council, the London Arts Council, Museum London, and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, financial supporters who kept us free as a festival throughout the entire pandemic. We're very grateful to everybody who supported us to make this festival possible throughout the pandemic months. So to start off, I would like to introduce all of our fab guests for tonight's event. André Forget is the former editor-in-chief of The Puritan and a contributing editor to Canadian Notes and Queries. His work has appeared in a variety of magazines and newspapers in Canada and the United States. His first novel, In the City of Pigs, was recently published by Dundurn Press in June, so it's hot off the press. André is the editor of a new anthology, After Realism, which I mentioned earlier, and I hope we'll hear more about this evening as well. Jessica Johns is a nehiyaw aunty and member of the Sucker Creek First Nation in Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta. She is the former managing editor for Room magazine and a co-organizer of the Indigenous Brilliance reading series in Vancouver. Most recently, her short story Bad Cree won the 2020 Writers Trust Journey Prize and won silver at the 2020 National Magazine Awards. Her short story, The Bull of Cromdale, was nominated for 2019 National Magazine Award in Fiction, and her debut chapbook, How Not to Spill, won the 2019 BP Nickel Chapbook Award. Her new novel, Bad Cree, will be alive to the world in January of 2023. And Aaron Schneider is the founding editor of the Thames Review and the founding editor of the Rusty Toque. He runs the Creative Writers Speaker Series at Western University, where he is an assistant professor in creative writing studies. His first book, Grass-Fed, was published by Quattro, and his collection of short fiction, What We Think We Know, which we'll hear more about today, is available from Gordon Hill Press. He also has a novel, The Supply Chain, forthcoming in 2022, and he tells me earlier that it's this fall that he's going to be launching that to the world. So Aaron, Andre, and Jessica, welcome to London's Words Festival. I'm going to start us off by turning to Andre, and I'd mentioned in my opening remarks your new collected anthology, After Realism, or After Realism, yes, collects together 24 short stories that offer alternatives or a provocative glimpse beyond the realist tradition as a perennial motive that has dominated Canadian writing. To get us started, and maybe to provide some foundation for us, I wonder if you could help us understand, even in some broad sketches, what some of the features and tendencies of this realist tradition of CanLit and beyond, and why it's important or even urgent for us to start to think beyond them.
I'll unmute myself, that'd help. Yeah, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I was putting together this anthology, and when one puts together an anthology, there needs to be some sort of organizing principle. And I thought of a few different principles that could be used. There's the national principle, right? It's Canadian. And I didn't want to do that for a variety of reasons. One of them was simply that I don't know if that's actually a particularly useful frame for understanding literature, especially in the 21st century. And as I was looking at these stories and thinking about my experience as an editor working with short stories for years, I would read hundreds of short stories through submissions, right? So you start to pick up on interesting little things that are going on, right? And I found that there was a real interest in a lot of the writers who were submitting in playing with this idea of reality, of the real, and in some cases that's including supernatural elements in a story, right? In some cases that's using autofiction, where a huge part of what makes autofiction is the idea that this is the goods, this is real stuff that actually happened to this person. So I was playing around with this idea of a lot of these short stories that I grew up on, that I love, Mavis Gallant, Alice Munro, like no shade to
right,
to those writers. I mean, I really love a lot of that stuff, but I felt that there was something changing or something moving, and I wanted to kind of focus in on that and spend some time thinking about why that might be happening. Because I think a lot of the stories in After Realism do contain elements of realism, but they're pushing. There's a sense of tension. And in my introduction, I argue that sense of tension is in some way influenced by the fact that we live in a reality that's increasingly difficult to represent. Over the past 10 years, a lot of people would say, but I think really, it's a long trend that's been going on probably since the beginning of the century. There's a sense of anxiety about reality and the reality we experience, the role that literature has in creating realities or reflecting them. Yeah, so I found that that to me was just a very productive idea to think about. And I found that the stories, as soon as I started thinking about them in that way, all sorts of connections opened up in what the writers were writing about and how they were writing, style. Yeah, so I think that's kind of where the collection really kind of came into being in my mind.
Right. So it's not, as you say in your essay, it's not the post-realism, it's after realism. And you have this really interesting way of parsing out after realism. Could you say a little bit more about why you added after as the modifier of this tradition?
Yeah, well, post-realism just seemed wrong. It seemed like you walk into a bookshop, you'll find plenty of realist fiction, right? So it's not right that, we're just not writing this kind of thing anymore. But I like after as a term because you'll often see it in poetry, right? That a poem is written after a certain poet. Right. And so there's a sense of homage, but then there's also a sense of maybe tension or competition or challenge almost that's going on between poets, and that's not necessarily hostile, although it can be. So the word seemed like the right one. I don't want to make too bold a claim about what's happening, but I also think that there is something happening.
Right, and that's fantastic. That really gets us off on a great footing in terms of what we're thinking about here in terms of that term experimentation. In the introduction to After Realism, Jessica, you appear as one of the first authors mentioned, I believe in the first paragraph you're mentioned by André in reference to your short story, Good Bones. And André draws this really fascinating comparison between what you call a standard eulogy and conventional realism, where platitudes and cliches, as André notes, seduce us into thinking they're adequate to the things they describe, like a eulogy matching up to the person in life. The narrator of your story, by contrast, who has imagined the deaths over almost everyone she knows, creates eulogies that verge or into the fantastical. And I also love the dream work of Bad Cree as well, those haunting crows. In your writing process, how do these moments of formal innovation emerge? Do they come to you like a compelling opening or closing line that you build around, or do they come in the writing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there are a couple of elements to this. The first is really questioning the idea of, and André even does this in this introduction a little bit, which is that reality to who? So a lot of what can be considered supernatural, a lot of what can be considered speculative fiction in the works of a lot of the time, like Black and Indigenous people, that is reality. That's very much based in a reality they and we experience. So the dream work in Bad Cree, for example, dreams are a very integral aspect of how Cree people understand the world. It's how we understand information. It's how we impart information from different realms, because different realms exist for us. And people and ancestors live in these different realms, and how do you talk to them? That's how. And with the eulogies, being able to speak to something that hasn't happened yet, such as a death. I mean, a large part of that story is somebody grappling with this new reality of many deaths in her life. So a part of that is just me really wanting to bring what I interpret, what I experience rather, as my everyday reality into build that world, build that future into writing. And then, it's difficult, especially when we have particular genres that we do, particularly in marketing and things like that. We do want to, hold on to these and we want to use them to be able to describe something that other people will understand as experimental or what have you. But in some cases, that's not experimental at all, depending on who that person is, or that's not, that sits firmly in realism and nothing else. So I think in trying to do that, it creates that tension. It creates really great discussions like this, and opens up a lot when we talk about what contemporary realism can look like. And actually, as Andre was just talking before about these, because same thing, these are the the Canadian realist writers that I read and had to study growing up, wrote in a particular way that didn't necessarily speak to me. And I think also a part of that shift, certainly being in this age of, and in a time of increasing uncertainty and fear, is part of this shift. And another part is that the Canadian literary scene, which is still predominantly white, at that time in particular, was it. And now we're seeing, which you see in this anthology, all the different contemporary writers, the Black and Indigenous writers, writers of color, queer writers, gender diverse writers, and a reality that perhaps some people just aren't used to seeing. And I think that is a really wonderful shift, and also incredibly necessary.
Absolutely. I was thinking, I was thinking as you were saying that, I think I read somewhere that when you were doing your MFA, somebody had given you the advice not to read about not to write about your dreams. And it was even right there where you started to resist that. Is that the case with the?
Yeah, that was the original impetus for Bad Cree, the short story. It was in a nonfiction writing workshop. And at the time, this has changed in the institution where I did my MFA. But at the time, there weren't any Indigenous or Black writers, professors. And so I was in this nonfiction class, and the professor gave this very, what he thought was advice to us writing nonfiction, which was that don't write about your dreams. You will lose your readers. They will get bored. You will not, that it's not a reality. Like, that's not something that belongs in nonfiction. If you're gonna write dreams, write about it in poetry or something like that. And that just didn't sit with me, because as I said, that's reality to me. That's how that's my life. So why would I not put that in my nonfiction?
Right.
So it's a disjointed way for a disjointed piece of advice for me, an emerging writer wanting to do this thing and be successful, whatever that means, and also how I was brought up and taught to believe. And so I wrote this Bad Cree, though it's fiction. I wrote it as a talk back to this initially, and then as I was writing it, I thought I don't want to all of my writing to be resistance. I don't want to be because in that way I'm still centering a colonial perspective of what dreams is, what dreams are and what dreams can be. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to center and keep centering my own, which is dreams being this very powerful source of knowledge and magic. And so it shifted, and my intention with it shifted, which I'm glad it did, but it certainly was sparked from what I would say very bad advice.
Right. And now you can read the outcome of that in the Journey Prize collection, where it is nicely collected together. To Aaron, as I was reading through the stories in your new book, I was struck by how daring, audacious, I would even say, you are with innovating on form, including your use of autofiction, as Andre had mentioned earlier, to explore challenging subject matter, your playfulness with perspective, and even the use of language around data analysis alongside an interrogation of lived experience. For example, in your book, you can find figures, charts and graphs, researcher interview, and heavy footnoting, statistical analysis. You've noted that the book taken together tracks your progression from more conventional writing towards experimental forms of writing. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more of that progression towards the experimental and why that's so essential to your book.
I mean, the progression is pretty straightforward, right? I think that it's a very typical kind of movement. You start off writing the kind of things that you read. And I think that all three of us have already talked about sort of beginning by reading pretty conventional stuff, and then you start to move away from it. And in my case, that's motivated by all sorts of things. I think that a part of, so just to take one element of what you talked about, right? But part of the use of things like the instruments of data analysis and representation, so figures, charts, things like that. A bunch of that stuff was written sort of around the beginning of the pandemic and kind of edited as it progressed. And that's a period where, and there are ways in which those kinds of ways of communicating information have become more and more predominant over the past couple of decades. But that really intensified in those years, right? I think at this point, we're all very, very used to looking at information as data points, right? And at the visual representation of information. Like we were talking earlier, I mean, you can think about the pandemic, but we were talking earlier about the war in Ukraine, which comes to us through the media as sort of as stories of like heroism and tragedy, but also as a set of data points. This many guns, we need this many artillery pieces, right? As a set of numbers. And that was really, really intensified during the pandemic. So there's a way in which it didn't feel particularly experimental to do that. In that moment, you know, the most experimental and most audacious, the least realistic thing would be to write a pretty conventional story that ends with it, you know, that follows a standard kind of narrative and ends with an epiphany. You know, that would feel just extraordinarily at odds with reality. So it just seems to fit with the way that we're encountering the world at this particular moment. Right, there's a Spanish writer I really like called Agustin Fernando Malo, who has this idea called complex realism. And his idea is that the way you write needs to reflect the circumstances in which you write. So he wrote a trilogy that essentially narratively is the equivalent of like changing channels on a television set with cable. When there's nothing on any of the channels, so you just keep cycling through them. But you know, if you look around your world, look around the world that you're in when you're writing, there's something to that idea of taking the way in which stories come to you and taking the way in which information and narrative comes to you in that moment, and reflecting that into your stories. It is admittedly different than what you would consistently see in writing, but to me at least, it doesn't feel that different for that particular reason, right? Because it emerges out of a particular moment, context, and hopefully speaks to people who are embedded in that same moment and context.
Right. And you're right too. During the pandemic, I have friends who would update us on, you know, the figures of COVID deaths and COVID cases like they were updating sports scores. You know, it was just this constant monitoring of these data points that were unfolding. I have a question too about the autofictive in your collection, which really you delve deep into subjects that are very personal to your life. I imagine are very personal, and the story, not unlike what you're describing, that they do have a kind of conventional cleaving to notions of realism, like stories of fathers and sons. That's something you're going to discover. But with the experimental form that you use, I wonder, maybe I'll let you phrase this out. Does the experimental form allow you to go into topics that are so challenging to you?
I don't know, maybe a little bit. I think that in that case, what it allowed was to draw together a lot of different things. And so it's less a question of going into those topics, but it allowed the space to understand them in a more complex and nuanced way. to set up a set of juxtapositions that make the kind of basic personal experiences at the core of that, that give them a little bit, hopefully more resonance, that allow them to speak to something other than just the relationship that I was talking about. So at least in that respect, the experimental form allowed them to breathe a little bit. I don't think it was necessary to kind of write about them. It was probably necessary to write about them in a way that was worth sharing with anyone.
Right.
Right, because otherwise it would have been very close to journaling. And I don't really want to inflict that on anyone else.
Right. And Jessica, in your writing, I've also noticed a theme of mothers and daughters, and fathers and daughters as well, like the story about the bull, which I really enjoyed. Even in the title poem of your chapbook, How to Spill, we can see that relationship to mothers and daughters. What is it that attracts you to that subject as well in your writing, that intergenerational discussion that unfolds, whether it's your life or not, or the narrators of your stories, but it's something that I see coming back in your writing.
Yeah, I think that it is something that I am very these generational relationships, whether that is mother and daughter or auntie, and they're nibbling, or grandfather, grandma, again, like ancestors that have come before us and ancestors that will come after, future ancestors. I think about those relationships a lot. And it is something I'm particular, the only word that I can think of at the moment for it is like particularly obsessed with, which is because, I think a lot about, of course, intergenerational trauma, as that is something I think through a lot, and the effects that that has had on me, that has had on my kin, but also intergenerational and generational joy, and what that looks like to pass that on, what it looks like to want to create futures for my kin that are coming after me, that I want to have them witness, and how my mother was also trying to do that for her children in big and little ways. And so I keep returning back to that in my work a lot. I also think that the wet nature of relationships is very, very, I always say that I'm not going to like bring any talk that I'm in back to treaty, but unfortunately it just happens in my brain. But I think about the direct relationship between what treaty is, which is establishing and building relationships, and these webbed relationships that we have, and how essential and important they are. And I've been thinking about them all my life without realizing it, all my life, because that is how I have been taught how to be in social situations, is being at these massive family gatherings where a million aunts and uncles and other family members there's a governance going on at all times, and learning that governance system, and bringing that into my own world and in how I forge other relationships, it just all comes back to that. And yeah, I think that it's just a very particular, it's a very particular thing that I'm always working through. So it makes its way into anything I write.
Right, that's brilliant. One of the common threads that works across all three of your work is a commitment to the short story form as a genre of experimentation, whether that's in terms of form or subject matter, as we've been discussing right now, language, style, and so forth. The great short story writer, Frank O'Connor, famously stated, and this is his words, "For the short story writer, there is no such thing as an essential form." The plasticity of the genre seems to lend itself to experimentation, but I imagine there may also be a kind of anxiety around the openness of the form of the short story as well. And it's a question for all of you, and maybe I can start with André. What is it about the short story? Because I know you've collected in the anthology, you've collected these the short stories to make up after realism. What is it about the short story, do you think, that lends itself so much to experimental work?
Very good question. I think, well, first of all, I should say, I don't think of myself as a short story writer, in part because I have a huge amount of respect for the form.
Right.
And I think it takes quite a bit of dedication to figure out how to write your kind of short story, because it has that plasticity, as you say. So I've always been drawn to it as a kind of like, this is I don't know, it's a bit like, to bring in a music analogy, there's something about, a very short pop song, that it's 2 to 3 minutes. There's a huge amount that has to be done in that time in order to immediately bring someone into a world, into a feeling, into a mood, and then to play with that mood. I have a huge amount of respect for it. And in putting together the anthology, part of the pleasure was just reading a lot of short stories by writers I hugely admire. And it was hard because I wrestled with whether or not to include excerpts of novels.
Right.
Right, because there were certain writers who I wanted to have in there because I am a huge fan of their work. But in the end, I decided that it wouldn't quite work. It wouldn't quite work for this as a collection of specifically short stories that are all bound together in part by their commitment to doing this kind of work. Yeah.
That's great. That's fantastic. And you've anticipated a question, so we'll hold this in abeyance for a moment. But because all three of you also have novels that have just recently emerged to the world or will, and I do want to ask you about that relationality between the short story and the novel, and whether there's things that you can do in the short story but not the novel. But before we get to that, I'd like to hear from Jessica and Aaron, and maybe after you have a chance to chat about it, maybe we could also get an example from your writing. Although I'm not sure if it's necessarily a short story that you selected, but we'll get a sample of maybe your writing afterwards. So maybe I could, either one, who would like to go next in terms of that short story?
Me.
Yeah.
All right. So why the short story? And
whether it lends itself to experimentation. Yeah.
So I think I like that quote from O'Connor, just because at least when I sit down to write, my starting point is an understanding of this short story as something that really only exists as a word limit. And often, sometimes, not often, but sometimes doesn't even necessarily need to include words. So there's this openness to it. I think one of the reasons that it potentially works, or I should say, like, it works for me for experimentation, is especially if you do something a little bit unexpected from a reader's perspective. And if you do something maybe complex, but also a little bit out there and a little bit unique, those kinds of things sometimes have a time limit on how long they'll work for.
Right.
And like they just, it's just a nice kind of like, they're kind of tricks sometimes, right? And the trick works for 5-10 pages. But if you were to stretch it out to a novel, it would really wear, I think. So it's something simple as that, at least from my perspective. And then like, it's also just a question of what stories you want to tell. And sometimes you want to focus on a particular moment, a transition, a way of looking at a character, and that's all. And that's makes for a really strong short story and a very weak novel. So
right. And do you have something ready that you could read for us?
Sure.
And I think you're going to be sharing your screen.
I am, yeah. So this is from the third story in the collection. There's an appendix of, there's three short stories. This is the third one, and they're all linked. They follow a character through a substantial portion of her life. And this third one, the section that I'm going to read to you from, is a series of charts that analyze her relationships. So it's changes in emotional commitment over time, Kara and selected long-term partners, and relevant secondary variables. Characters called Kara. So I'm just going to give you a brief explanation of how the charts work, and then dive into a couple of them. So solid lines indicate emotional states or intensities confirmed by the partner and supported by external observation. Gaps indicate an absence of reliable data. Broken lines indicate a discrepancy between reports from the partners and external observers. In these cases, values have been weighted according to the reliability of the informants and adjusted to match trends in the reliable values in the data set. Values are represented in a numerical scale that ranges from -10 to 10, and represent relative intensities rather than absolute quantities. So I'm going to start you with the first chart. This picks up a portion of the way through the story, and it comes after a really tumultuous relationship, the kind of relationship that is defined primarily by the fights the two partners have. So figure 7C, Kara and Mike Spur, casual relationship, 2006. Both parties' accounts are mirror true reflections of the relationship, or in other words, correspond exactly in their outlines and constitutive details, but transposed. Kara reported that Mike Spur was as invested as he reported she was, and vice versa. In this case, both the data and its attribution are in dispute. We have represented both lines and used that vertical mark, which means or, between them to indicate that each line may represent the investment of either Kara or Mike Spur, but not both. So that assigning one line to one partner automatically but not permanently assigns a second line to the other partner. The two lines must be read as equally significant, definite in their values, but indeterminate in their reference. Presence to herself, the third variable in the graph, represents Kara's presence in the moment of their being together in the small, self-contained universe that every couple creates around themselves, no matter how casually and incidentally they are connected. For Kara, these oases of enclosure combined with Mike Spur's essential indifference to create a stillness through which her sense of self could slowly return. It come back to her like a person who arrived on foot from a long way away, a figure that she watched as it became clearer or more definite by the barely measurable units of footsteps that neither hurried nor delayed, that approached at a rate that was uniquely its own, approached for what seemed like an impossible length of time until suddenly it was there within hailing distance, and its face was around. Figure 8C, Kara and Sebastian Shade relationship, 2006 to 2008. No reliable data exists. Both Kara and Sebastian Shade confirm either explicitly by implication or by telling omission the existence of a relationship stretching from late September of 2006 to February of 2008. However, neither provides sufficient or sufficiently consistent data points to produce even a hypothetical representation of this relationship. External observers might likewise confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt the existence of the relationship, but could provide no specific data on its nature, intensity, fluctuations, etc. Sebastian Shade climbed the 5 steps to Kara's house on Oxford Street an unspecified number of times. Kara climbed the 2 steps to his townhouse in the northwest corner of the city at least once. 2 doors closed behind them and remain sealed to this day. Despite our best efforts, we've been unable to pry them open. Figure 9C, Kara and John Neves, relationship 2011 to 2015. Both partners' investments in each other are represented with broken lines, not because they are in dispute. Both Kara and John Neves describe their entire relationship and its limited but still detectable fluctuations in reliable detail, and the descriptions were uniformly reflected in reports from external observers, but because they represent something other than romantic love and its various affective cognates, something closer to friendship, really, as both Kara and John Neves made clear, but which neither would specifically confirm, the comfort from someone whose life and interests you share without friction, with whom you never argue about what to watch or which restaurant to order dinner from on Friday night or how to love each other. And if you argue, everyone does, do they not? You do so only with an easy calmness that makes dispute synonymous with debate. As they both realized on a Tuesday evening in the middle of October when the city was cool without being cold, and Kara looked at him from across the room and said, "I'm moving out," agreement is not synonymous with commitment. And in figure 10C, this is the last one, Kara and Alexander Campbell relationship 2014 ongoing. There is in these two unbroken lines, reaching with little variation from November 2014 to the moment at which you read this into the vanishing point of the future, happiness of a kind whose accumulating depth and breadth exceed the crude representation of this pair of lines and forces us, the researchers, to reckon with the limits of our tools, devices, frames, etc. In short, with all of the apparatus of investigation and consequently with the investigation itself. In its gnomic simplicity, the right-hand side of this figure confronts us simultaneously, as if our two sentiments are on at first parallel and then gently but inevitably convergent trajectories, as if they are in some way indistinguishable from the collection of data points to which we have reduced Kara and Alexander Campbell, with our own inadequacy and our shame. Thanks.
Brilliant. One thing that we miss when we do the webinar event is the applause that everybody would be sending for that wonderful reading. Thank you so much, Aaron. And we're going to come back and chat a little bit more too about some of the things that you're doing in that passage from Kara's triptych in the first section of your book, which Aaron's book here, a nice shot there as well. And I put in the chat links to everybody's websites. So Jessica, to go back to the question of the short story and how it might lend itself to experimentation for you.
Yeah, I love short stories so much. I love reading them. I love writing them. And I think in particular because it kind of allows you, it allows you to play in a way that maybe for a longer work wouldn't, or maybe a longer work would, but the effect would be very different. I think there's also ways that, you know, experimental instances that work for novels as well that might not for short stories. So they're just very specific things for these different genres if you think about the genres that way. But I do think it allows for a particular type of experimentation, which Aaron kind of touched on, which is that you can do these things that might not work for a really long, for pages and pages, but for a short thing, it can do something really cool. I also think that it strips away everything else. You really have to, whatever you want to get to, whatever it is, that feeling you want to elicit or the thing you want to say, there's restrictions. There's a restriction of space. There's a restriction of words or whatever. And so it's a challenge. You have to work to really get that to happen in a way that makes sense to you. So that's how I think it lends itself a little bit.
Absolutely, that's a brilliant answer. And would you have something that you could offer to everyone by way of reading?
Sure. I'm actually going to read a couple of pages from The Bull of the Cromdale, which is in the 2019 Best Canadian Essays. The reason that I'm going to read this is a couple. First is that it is about the Bull of the Cromdale, as noted in the story, is my papa, who, which means my mushum, my grandpa. And I just came back from my territory very recently where he lived. At the time of writing this, he was still alive. I wrote this in 2019 and he passed last year, last September. So this, I haven't revisited this piece and I haven't read it in a long time. And just going back to his territory, my territory, and thinking about him a lot, I just thought it'd be really nice to revisit this piece. And also because this was included in Best Canadian Essays, and I wrote it as a piece of fiction. So it's interesting because of how this piece was interpreted to certain people. And I didn't correct them because I wanted to be included in an anthology. But also, like, it's largely based in reality, but there's just elements of it that I couldn't possibly know, things about his past, stories that I've been told that I had to make up. So in my mind, you know, it lived in this other genre, but like neither one of them really do the piece that justice if we think about them in these very defined terms. So I will read a couple pages. It's called The Bull of the Cromdale. My papa used to be called the Bull. Back when he had black hair, styled it like Elvis, and wore cowboy boots with silver heels. He lived with his cousin Dustin in Edmonton's north side neighborhood of Cromdale, which was off 118th Ave, which is also called the Avenue of Champions. If you didn't live in the area, you knew the Avenue of Champions was where Johns went to pick up women and where the machete attack happened. If you lived in the area, you knew the things that didn't get reported, but you knew the good things too. The Cromdale Hotel was a staple of the Avenue of Champions, and that's where the Bull was made. The hotel had 44 rooms, and the attached bar had a pool table with only a couple divots, cheap beer, and country music. Papa and Dustin sharked people every night and could have made a living out of it if they wanted to, but Dustin was a Belrose, which meant he was small and made trouble. Started fights with nehiyaw, he knew the Bull would finish. Some people called the Cromdale a hole to house men who didn't know where else to go. My papa called it magic. I learned about the Bull, this man that my papa used to be, in the same way I learned everything about my family. In East Prairie, sitting against the backdrop of my papa's farm, gathering little bits of information and trying to piece them together like shredded paper. I learned that Papa and Dustin left East Prairie together when they were 15, because even though Edmonton wasn't big then, it was bigger than the Métis settlement where they were born, big enough for their dreams to fit. Papa and me were playing darts, and he skunked me for the millionth time like he could do it in his sleep. I've never seen anyone throw darts like him. Dad just shook his head. He remembered the Bull better than anyone. The Bull could play poker, darts, and pool at the same time, Dad said. He could spot a cheater through tobacco smoke and a 2-4 of whiskey. If anyone stepped too close or had eyes too hard, he'd knock them out before they had time to blink. The Bull, Dad said, never lost. Then he conjured the man. Dad told stories about how Papa used to bring together the whole neighborhood, how he could strip sound right from the airwaves, how under the wing of the Bull of the Cromdale, you were always safe. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Even when I slept, the Bull lived in the periphery of my dreams. The dreams started coming in waves in the winters and changed with every new story I heard, but the Bull stayed the same. He was like how I saw him in every old photo stuck to the fridge or creased between book pages. Black button-up shirt, arms spread across the shoulders of his cousins, a smile so wide it looked like a wound. He moved like he was floating and I couldn't look at him directly or he disappeared. So I watched him from the corners of my eyes, tried not to lose him in the rest of the noise or the other people who would come to visit. Most times he ignored me. Sometimes he watched me back. After Papa had been living in Edmonton for a while, he started working at McTarren's bookbinding factory where he met my grandma. Papa would sometimes glue pages out of order, and when Grandma asked him about it, he said it was because logic was no good for stories or for dreaming. She said that's when she fell in love with him, my Uncle Will and my dad, but they were surprised about the changes. Papa packed up and moved to a quiet suburb further south where no one yelled in the streets after dark. He started gluing pages in the right order, and even though he was still the bull, it was only on weekends. He had people to take care of, and he did. By the time my dad was 12 and Uncle Will was 13, they'd already grown to love the weekends as much as Papa. They'd stow away in the backseat of his Ford pickup when he'd head to the Cromdale, hang around Papa's old neighborhood, and get into trouble of their own. One night, Uncle Will tried his luck getting into the Cromdale and made it pretty far before getting into a rumble. Nobody believed the bull at first when he stepped in and said that the white boy getting roughed up was his, but they believed him pretty good after he beat the other guy bloodier than he'd ever beat anybody. When Uncle Will talks about what he saw, he says the bull grew 10 inches taller and 5 inches wider the minute he stepped into the Cromdale. He says it must have been the smoke or the dark, but he saw the wooden beams of the bar move in waves around Papa's body, like it was making room for him. In the Cromdale, Uncle swears the bull was magic. And that's where I'm gonna leave that there. Thank you.
Brilliant. That is absolutely terrific. Thank you so much for that reading, for both of your readings, Aaron and Jessica. I mentioned right off the top that all three of you have either a novel that's recently out or is going to come out very, very soon. And that does lend me to this question that I anticipated earlier about how experimentation comes to the novel. And whether there are things that you can do in the novel that you can't in the short story, and vice versa. And I want to turn to André because you have a new novel that was out in June, and we'll hopefully get to hear about this. And I wonder if you could talk about experimentation in the novel and how you, as a writer, wrestle with that question.
Yeah, I didn't set out to write an experimental novel. I mean, for a first book, the challenge that I had set myself was I want this to be readable. I want it to move. I want people to want to keep reading. And I felt that that was important because it's hard to do. Like, it's a challenge to actually to do that. And I have a tendency to over-intellectualize things and make excuses for myself and say, well, it's supposed to be, and there's a bit of that in here. there is a little bit of that, but I really wanted to see if I could pull it off. I really wanted to see if I could write something like Bildungsroman, kind of traditional thing. But I also wanted to play around with structure. And the novel came about because back in 2017, my friend Joel Peters, who's a composer based in Montreal, who composes for the organ primarily, got in touch with me and said, do you want to write a story about an underwater organ? And I thought, well, sure, that's a good prompt. What I'm working on now isn't going well, so why not this underwater organ thing? I think he wanted something kind of short and Kafkaesque, like a little parable. And I gave him 10,000 words about a journalist going to write about an underwater organ that's being built in Halifax. So after I wrote the story, I sent it back to Joel, and they composed a concert around the idea. In the story, we brought in some poets who wrote poetry that was about this underwater organ or hydro-organon. And then we put on the show. And in the brochure, like, we included an excerpt which kind of talks about the origins of these organs. And I was quite shocked by the number of people who came up to me after the event and were like, why have I never heard about this? Because it's not real. These don't exist. But I had tried to use a very kind of academic voice or journalistic voice in writing about it. And I think that style, for a lot of people, it was like, well, this sounds real. This doesn't sound like a story. This sounds like something I would read in a magazine. So that really got me interested in the way that the tone of something kind of tells us how we should relate to it. And that's often a problem, right? Because, you know, academic language has been used to further all kinds of ghastly intellectual projects, right? And it's been able to do that in part because it sort of sounds very official and very competent, and that's a dangerous thing, you know. And so I wanted the play in the book to be partially about playing around with how these kind of language cues tell us how to take something. And so after I'd written this story, I wrote three others, I wrote five others. Two of them got cut. So the novel is 4 parts. Each of the parts has the journalist writing about a specific artistic performance or a specific artist. And it's structured a little bit like a symphony. So rather than having, you know, we're introduced to the character, the problem of the novel is introduced, and we have that classic Aristotelian kind of rising action, climax, falling action. Instead, I wanted to think about how a symphony works, and a symphony tends to work a lot more with mood, right? So the first movement has a certain mood and is often in a certain key, or has a certain tone, and then the second movement is different, and the third movement and the fourth movement. So I tried to do that with the different parts of the novel to give each of them its own sense, its own focus, and to let the kind of greater themes of the book emerge throughout the whole thing, not in an obvious kind of way, but in a maybe a more subtle way. Was what I was trying to do. My editor told me that if I was marketing it as a novel, I needed to have, at some point, I needed to have certain things, and so I was convinced that was the case. So there is a kind of climactic scene and that kind of thing. But I think the experiment that I was playing around with was about structure and voice.
Brilliant. I actually threw a link into the chat to the project. I was looking at this exact project earlier, and there's a nice video too by your collaborators where they walk through, and you can hear the organ music that they came up for the project. So I definitely recommend everybody check out that link. Could we hear some of what you're describing? Could you read some for us?
Absolutely. So I'm reading from the second movement, which is set in Halifax and is about these underwater organs. And I think it hopefully will kind of get at some of what I'm talking about here. The origins of hydro-organ anthology are contested. Print references to underwater organs are almost non-existent before the 19th century, but this has not stopped some of the more enthusiastic hydro-organ anthologists from arguing that they are nearly as old as their more famous terrestrial counterparts. Textual evidence suggests a hydro-organ may have been among the many pleasures Tiberius arranged to be built as part of his Villa Jovis on Capri, although the archaeological record is so scant and the possibility so unlikely given the villa's placement high on a rocky promontory that most scholars dismiss it as being fanciful. A more substantive piece of evidence is the San Marcos, discovered just off the coast of Spain in 1977, which included several large pipes and a wind chest dating from the 15th century. Given that the remains are a mere kilometer from the site of a galleon known to have been wrecked en route from Genoa, however, the argument that it is a primitive hydro-organ and not simply the scattered parts of a conventional organ rather strains credulity. Most scholars agree that the first indisputable reference to an underwater organ came with the publication of Giovanni Bonavista's Catalogue of Musical Instruments New and Proposed in 1765, which includes schema for a rudimentary hydro-organ featuring 10 pipes and a bellows operated through an ingenious series of hoses and manual pumps. Bonavista claimed that the hydro-organ was a completely novel instrument and was in fact the first to use the term hydro-organ to describe a subaqueous organ. But this claim has been frequently debated. Skeptics point out that Bonavista was hardly scrupulous when it came to crediting his sources and had a tendency to claim authorship for ideas for instruments that had venerable, if usually obscure, theoretical pedigrees. It wasn't until later in the 19th century following the spread of the Industrial Revolution across Europe, that speculative hydroorganonics really became a popular exercise for engineers and organ makers. No less an inventor than Isenberg Kingdom Brunel came up with a design for a hydroorgan to be built off the coast of Cornwall. And Richard Strauss and Igor Stravinsky are both reputed to have written works for the theoretical instrument. Autographs are yet to be found for either. But it was after the Second World War that hydroorganology really came into its own as a discipline. During the post-war construction boom, several of the more experimental architects placed miniature non-functional hydroorgans in artificial ponds, marine parks, waterfalls, etc. And John Cage's journals are filled with references to the instrument. It is rumored that he made several attempts in the 60s and 70s to raise funds to build a test hydroorgan in the Hudson River near Stony Point. And it has been argued, most notably by Dr. Susan Shaw, the maverick director of Winnipeg's New Music Festival during its turbulent and anarchic period in the late 1980s, that Cage's legendary 433 was inspired by the paradoxical acoustical possibilities of an underwater organ. Shaw believed the famous 4.5 minutes of silence were a tribute and gesture toward a future in which that silence could be filled by the deep tones of a hydroorgan. She even theorized that Cage had written a companion piece to 433, consisting of a score exactly 4 minutes and 33 seconds in length, to be played on a hydroorgan once it had been invented. But the beginning of modern hydroorganology as a fully actualized musical discipline is precisely datable. On August 15, 1993, an unknown aquatic engineer / architect / amateur organist named Kenji Saito announced that he had completed his Senritsu, the first full-scale, fully functional hydroorgan to be built in the modern era, off the coast of Numazu in Japan's Suruga Bay. Overnight, hydroorganology went from being an armchair science to a controversial new form of public art, one that united disciplines as diverse as acoustics, oceanography, architecture, and musicology. Saito's masterpiece offered a concrete example of the challenges of practical hydroorganonics and a new way of thinking about the musical and musicological possibilities of the instrument. The first public performance on the Senritsu featured a program built around Bach's Clavier Ubung III, with some of Saito's own improvisations thrown in to show the range of the instrument. A recording was made, but issues regarding ownership and copyright have kept it from public release. Those who have heard it note that it is vastly inferior to the experience of seeing the Senritsu in action. But even at this, the first recorded performance of a hydroorgan, the audience was sharply divided as to the nature of what they had witnessed. Most found the music itself completely secondary to the spectacle of watching the air jet and bubble out of the great pipes, and acknowledged they were at best able to hear only a rich humming sound, with a few quavering variations as new pipes were opened. But others, a decided, though not insubstantial minority, claimed to have heard a completely breathtaking range of tonal patterns. Not the music of a terrestrial organ, but a completely faithful transformation of it. Atsuo Tanako famously described it as like hearing Bach performed by whales. Over the course of the late summer and early autumn of 1993, Saito brought several diving groups down to view the hydroorgan, and word spread in avant-garde musical circles and among the more speculative branches of musicology of this massive organ built into a rock face at the bottom of a Japanese bay. The question of what the hydroorgan meant, having been completed at a time when the traditional pipe organ seemed little more than an anachronistic remainder from an era when people didn't have electricity and believed in God, quickly overshadowed the actual experience of listening to the performances themselves. At least for all but those stubborn few who insisted they heard something remarkable when the pipes were opened. Musicians and theorists made the pilgrimage to Numazu because they felt it would be gauche to write about the Senritsu if they hadn't actually heard it. Some of them came away utterly changed. Most of them managed to get something about it published in Music Perception or Interface. As the winter of 1993-1994 set in, Saito stopped bringing groups down to Senritsu, citing the unpredictable weather conditions. He spent the winter in his cabin on the slopes of Mount Fuji, where he could see the restless waters and dream of his hydroorgan. It is generally agreed that it was during these months he wrote what would stand as his own most complete theoretical account of hydroorganology, usually translated into English as the bass note. Saito resumed his tours the next spring to redoubled interest from both the local and international Baroque and classical communities. He received letters from Arvo Pärt, Philip Glass, and Kaija Sariaho, and was interviewed by the BBC. It was an odd story, and people liked its oddness. This young Japanese Renaissance man, with a quasi-mystical theory of harmony and a deep love for the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, had created an instrument that the professional music world had always imagined to be nothing more than a curiosity. And he had made it beautiful. Some even believed he had made it sing. Kenji Saito's burgeoning career as the first professional hydro-organist ended early in the morning on June 18th, 1995, when his body was found floating off the coast of Nishiizu. He was wearing his wetsuit and his mask was off, although his oxygen tank was still at 30%. It was clear he had drowned. No one, however, was able to explain why.
Huzzah. I love this this lore, this story, this entire academic discipline that you have built around the hydro organon. It's really fascinating, the reference to John Cage. I remember while I was reading, I was just I was laughing out loud, also in just complete awe of the story that you've stitched in. One of the things that I really love about that too is that the instrument itself is breaking the limits of a form, of an artistic form, in terms of whether actually people can hear this this particular instrument. So is there when you invented this entire disciplinarity, this entire instrument, were there places that you went in terms of thinking through on research, or was this something that you sat down and it was a complete imaginary exercise for you?
It all came very quickly. I mean, I'm very interested in music of all kinds. And Joel, who is my compatriot in this, I mean, he loves the 20th century avant-garde stuff. So I knew, like, a lot of this I kind of picked up along the way. Like, I kind of knew, you know, I knew the broad strokes. And so creating like this new instrument and throwing that in there was fun. It was a very fun thing to write. Yeah, and so the story continues with what happens after Saito's death, and his apprentice is building this organ in Halifax, and so the story kind of leads up with this question of, is there a sound? Like, does this thing actually work? Which yeah, it was again, came out of conversations with Joel about, you know, performance, and how do you know that what someone's experience of music is? And I think it's just such an interesting question that ties back to some of the other things we've talked about with realism. Like, how do I know that, you know, what your experience of reality is? I mean, it's I guess a bit of like a stoned undergraduate kind of question, like, do you see blue the way I see, you know? But I think, like, there's something there. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to start pulling questions up out of the chat to bring in. We've got a nice good flex half hour up until 8:30 that we can continue to roll through. And the first question I want to bring out of the chat is from David Montour. It's to Jessica, but I actually think it could be a question to anyone. We'll start with Jessica. Are you conscious of writing between the lines, of leaving something, some mystery on the page? I think this is a particularly great question around the short story form too, in terms of the concision and the compression of that particular genre. So maybe we could start with Jessica.
Yeah, I think yes, but it happens sometimes, and I'm sure this is true for perhaps everyone that writes in this form or in a longer form. Sometimes I do it as a tool. I won't say everything as a way to do something like Andre was saying before about creating a tone more than you're trying to tell something through the tone of it. Pardon me. And other things that go unsaid or like are written between the lines are things that some people that are very specifically like their Cree references, or they're I'm making a nod to something that perhaps only Cree people will know, because they have that piece of knowledge that will be like, oh, that that reference to this plant, say, is significant for this reason. For them, it will mean something different to them than it will to somebody who didn't know that. So I think there's, and that's unintentional in a way, because I'm not looking to spell it out. But I do think that it's a fun tool to use, particularly when you are trying to be concise and also, yeah, keep a bit of questioning happening on the reader's end as well.
Right. Any further thoughts from Andre or Aaron? We have another question here from Delaney for Jessica. Is there a character in one of your short stories who has stayed with you long after you finished writing?
That's a great question. Thanks, Delaney. Yeah, so the Bad Cree started as a short story that I expanded into the novel that is coming out in January 2023. And that is because I didn't think that story was done yet. And the main character, she stayed with me. Her name's Mackenzie. And I just felt there was more she was looking to do. And a lot of those unanswered questions that I intentionally put in the short story, I kind of wanted to answer them. I kind of wanted to explore them a little bit more. And yeah, that happened significantly, I would say, with that one. And I don't think that's happened for another short story. The other ones, that usually when I'm done with them, I feel pretty done with them.
And Aaron, is there any characters in your writing that have stayed with you after you finished writing?
No, I don't think so, actually. I think that, like, yeah, I think once you finish a piece, it just, yeah, it wraps it, right? It's like, or at least for me, coming to an end, and it's probably a sign that I know I've gotten to the end, that I've learned everything that I need to know about this person's set of people. So it feels complete, right? Like, you feels like you've established it. And like, I'll revisit them in the sense of returning to and thinking about them, but not in a way that I feel like I need to add, a couple extra pages to the story or something like that. So, yeah.
Right. Arena has a question for us, and I think actually it's a good one for everybody or anybody who would like to take it up. But Jessica, this question was inspired by something that you'd remarked. Realism suggests art reflecting reality. Could you reflect on the process of writing as translation from reality to reality, from realism to realism, or maybe between realities and realisms? What are the fulfilling frustration aspects of this process? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure.
Yep.
I'm just rereading the question.
Yep. Yeah, I knew I was giving you all a moment to look at it.
Yeah, no, it's really great. Fulfilling and frustrating aspects of this process. I think a fulfilling aspect of writing about a reality, that trying to speak to a reality that you feel, especially when you are afforded, when you are using tools and methods and maybe experimental things. allows you to do it in a way that feels true to you, which means sometimes that it's written in a very different way. It's not just a complete just a this is what's happening and I'm reflecting that exactly as it is on the page. There's no objectivity, I suppose. I want to say reality is very subjective, and so being able to write that reality in a way that makes sense to you as you experience that reality is fulfilling, I would say. The frustrating aspects, I mean, I would say the frustrating aspect of it is, yeah, it's kind of, it's going back to that like stoner question of like, does the moon look the same to you as it does to me? And it's like, you can be describing the moon as you see it to someone else. And if you don't know if they're actually interpreting it the way that you mean to. So perhaps a frustrating aspect of it, and I don't know if frustrating is the word I would use, but something that comes up with me a lot is I think like, is this coming across the way I intend it? You know, is the reality I'm trying to write one that is being in the way that I want it to be reflected? Or is it completely off the mark and people are reading something very different to what I think? But I suppose that is part and parcel of being a writer, is that's always going to be the case, because again, their realities are very different to yours. So how they read into it is very subjective as well.
Right. Great answer. Any further thoughts from Andre or Aaron on that question?
I like the idea of translating, because it does. One can forget that a book is just a bunch of sentences, you know. And in the case of Aaron, graphs also, you know. But it's like a sentence is a way of organizing reality that is artificial, right? And it arises because of the, you know, that we're language using creatures. And, you know, writing is a relatively recent development for humans. So you're creating a little world that corresponds to the big world that we all live in because of a series of conventions that we accept, right? And I think that one of the things I'm always coming back to as a writer is the fact that all of the language that I am using is inherited, right? It's the product of generations and generations of people using language in a certain way, and eventually that language becoming English rather than French or German. And if you go even further back, right? Like if you go far enough back, all of these languages are related, right? In certain ways. And I think it's very humbling to think about the fact that the language that creates the reality in which I exist is something that is beyond myself. And it's the creation of millions of other people. It's also deeply frustrating, right? Because we've inherited a language, the English language, deeply colonial, right? Most of our figures of speech come from business or warfare. In a rather shocking way. The English language encases within itself a deep kind of violence. And to write in English is, you know, means that you have to wrestle with that, which is maybe a bit of a tangent, but that's what the question made me think about.
That's terrific. We're getting close to time, but I want to ask a question because we are really lucky with all three of you that you have all been really involved in literary publishing in Canada. All three of you have had the role, or currently have the role, of being an editor of journals or publications. So maybe I could start with Aaron, but I want to ask each one of you this question in turn. I was listening to an interview that you did about the Thames Review, which is the journal that you started, founded, and edit. And at least in part, you were creating it in response to a kind of homogeneity in Canadian literary journals. I think that was the phrase that you used, and the lack of venues for genuinely experimental work. I think this is one of my favorite lines from the interview. You said to all the listeners out there to send you the strange stuff. So if there's anybody out there today who has some strange stuff, this is Aaron's call. Hopefully it still stands to send him the strange stuff. Yeah. Could I get you to talk about the genesis of the Thames Review and why it holds such a place for experimental?
Well, I just like literary publishing. I think it's important. I think that it's important to have, and I like particularly having the kind of publication where, and we do this fairly regularly, give people their first publication, because I think that that's like really useful to people and valuable to get a little bit of promotion, a few eyeballs, and that kind of boost of confidence. In terms of the strange stuff, I just read yeah, absolutely. The more the better. But I was involved in a journal before that folded, and was thinking of starting another one. And I actually was asking, by the time I finished, probably a couple dozen people, like if you had something that was really like genuinely experimental, pretty out there, how many journals in Canada do you think you could submit it to and get like a really honest, fair hearing for the piece? And this may mean I was talking to the wrong people, but no one I talked to got off one hand when counting. And I thought, this is a pretty big place, and that's not a lot of venues. It's also where my interest lies. So that's where that idea came from. And it's just, I mean, that's the stuff that I find interesting. I find the strange stuff interesting, but also people coming from different perspectives, because they tend to just have more interesting things to say. Their writing tends to carry that difference in ways that give it energy and urgency. And honestly, like, the other two people on this panel know this because they've done this work, right? Like, literary editing is a lot of drudge work. Like, it's a lot of stuff, a lot of time, a lot of work that you don't get a lot of credit for. But the flip side of that is getting to see this stuff and getting to put it out there. And that in and of itself is really exciting.
Right, that's terrific. And send Aaron the strange stuff. So Jessica, I know you're the former managing editor of Room Magazine, Canada's oldest feminist literary journal, and the are you still a co-organizer of Indigenous Brilliance as a series? Is that?
I'm a board member now of Indigenous Brilliance, so in a advisory role. But Indigenous Brilliance is still alive and kicking and doing amazing, amazing work. The people at the head of it are brilliant and still doing very, very cool stuff. But I was at I helped to develop it into existence.
Right, and that particular venue, Room Magazine, is so important in Canada. And like Aaron's describing, it's a very unique venue and very important for voices that have either been excluded or marginalized by that in quotation marks, can lit. I wonder if you can talk about your experience being a managing editor for that particular journal, and talk about how venues like that, how they can or they do open spaces for new voices and new styles.
Yeah, I love what Aaron said about sending the weird stuff. I feel like every issue that I edited, I really tried to elicit that exact same energy. It was just like whatever, like spooky stuff, weird stuff, things that don't, like, what is literary, like, send me that. I think the best thing that magazines can do to create space for things like first publications for people, for things like these really energetic and amazing pieces of literature that are coming out of writers these days, is to change, is to develop. Really seeing a need, seeing a gap in what literary magazines were offering and allowing to be published, and trying to fulfill that is a part of that change. Room Magazine, it is Canada's oldest feminist magazine. That also means that it was founded by white feminists, women, a long time ago. I should know how long, 50 years, something like that. And it very reasonably needed to change and develop as the magazine grew, and it did, changing its understanding of feminism to be more intersectional, to changing who we published by not being exclusively just for women, but also any marginalized gender. And, you know, yeah, the movement from centering white voices was something that was just a very necessary change and a growth that the magazine was, and the people involved in the magazine were very willing to do. Okay, thank you. It started in 1975. 1975. So, you know, and that's necessary. If you want to be publishing really exciting work, if you want to be a space for people to feel safe, you know, it's a vulnerable thing to send somebody your work, and it's a privilege to be able to read it, and to be able to edit it and to be able to publish it. That is a privilege. And ensuring that you are always doing the work as the magazine to, you know, create that space is very important. They're still doing that great work. I think other magazines are doing this as well. Guts magazine has also just come back to life after a bit of a hiatus. I'm also an editor for that now. Actually, that's the only magazine that I'm editing for currently. And again, it was a period of a brief hiatus. There's restructuring that seemed necessary to happen, and there were other things, just as Aaron kind of spoke to. You have to do a lot as an editor or somebody involved in the literary magazine world in Canada. That's a lot of labor and it's a lot of love. But yeah, I think that and then being able as a writer to find those spaces is really important, but it is on the magazines to grow and change and to create those spaces first and foremost.
Right, such important work, and a great description too of the work that Room has done and the other work that you're currently involved in right now. André, like Jessica, you fall into that category of former editor-in-chief, in this case, the Puritan, sorry. So you have also a unique perspective on how literary publishing can play a role in championing experimental work. And I see somebody put in the chat that the Puritan has a new experimental hybrid section as part of the offering. In your novel too, I really like this character of Henry Zimmerman, an editor-in-chief of Classical Modern, which is a great name for a Canadian literary journal, by the way. A magazine that publishes Alexander, the protagonist's experimental musical work, or musical reviews and reporting. I couldn't help but wonder, first of all, whether your experience informed that character, but in a wider level, I'm wondering if you could reflect based on your experience, what the role that literary publishing plays in narrowing or opening, and narrowing too, right? Because that's one of these questions too, of how publishing plays a role in gatekeeping, that horizon of possibility for new work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question right now, because there was a time when almost every city in Canada would have had a newspaper and would have published reviews of books, right? And that really doesn't exist in the way that it used to. I mean, there are a few newspapers that are still doing some stuff, but it's really much less than it used to be. That has corresponded with an explosion of these little magazines that I think have carried on that mandate of providing a venue for new writing, and then also providing a venue for reflection on that writing, for criticism, which is really important to have that conversation about new work. I mean, so in some ways it's like, well, okay, we lost a lot of the big papers, but we have all of these little magazines, and it's like, well, that is good, but the budgets, like I mean, that was my experience being editor-in-chief. You know, I got to edit a few things and I was very happy with that, but I really understood that my responsibility was putting resources behind the people editing the sections, finding good people who are going to be proactive about finding really good work, and then giving them resources to actually pay writers and then hopefully get stipends themselves. And that was it was a real struggle, right? You're creating a product in a sense, but you're giving it away for free. And it was really important to us that we give it away for free, and that we not expect writers to work for free. But you know, there's a structural challenge, right? And I think that where the rubber hits the road with that is like, well, who has time? Who has time to edit for free, right? Who has time to read submissions for free? Well, now you're automatically introducing a bottleneck in terms of people who have the economic stability, the free time, the leisure, the connections to be able to find out how to get into this. So you're like, the aperture remains unfortunately quite small because of those economic realities. And I don't see it getting easier. I do think it's amazing how many people are still working really hard to do this work and are still putting resources into it and fighting for their writers and their publications. But it's I don't think the public understands how much free labor has created. You know, any book you see in the bookshop, a whole bunch of free labor was necessary for that person to be able to start publishing, to get experience, to get to the point where they could start submitting a longer work. And I think that that's often invisible, which is a shame.
Right. Thank you so much, everybody. I see that we're just past the time, and I told our amazing guests that I put a hard limit on 8:30, and I've already broken it. This was a really wonderful discussion, chock-a-block with insights and thoughts on new direction, readings of amazing work that is out now or will be coming out very, very soon. I would like to thank André Forget, pick up his new novel that is out as of last month. Pick up Aaron Schneider's new book that's out from Gordon Hill here. And I have the Journey Prize book that collects Jessica John's work. Thank you so much, Jessica Johns. All three of our guests tonight have new work out, so please do check it out. I want to thank everybody who's been so active in the chat. You're all amazing, picking up dates for us and asking great questions, and everybody that's hung into it right till the end. So thank you so much. This was a real pleasure to be the host of, and I'm so glad that we were able to welcome André, Jessica, and Aaron, and all of you out there in Internetlandia, wherever you're coming from. I saw at the start that from coast to coast, we have people joining us, which is really heartwarming to see. So everybody stay safe, and thank you very much for tuning in, and stay tuned for more Words events in the summer. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Bye.